Again, I'm going to try to finish up Colossians chapter 2. And let's start by reading verses. It's kind of a section of your handout, verses 13 through 15. And before we get into the last section, we're going to kind of revisit some stuff. But chapter 2, verse 13 through 15 of Colossians chapter 2. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out. I can't read today. Taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. When he had disarmed the rulers, I have never read this bad in my life. When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Okay, so I don't know what's going on. I did kind of look at the sun a little bit, and I haven't got my full focus back yet. We'll work on that. So. Okay, we read this, we looked at this a little bit, but we mainly looked at the verses ahead of it last week. But any thoughts on these verses 13 through 15?
Seems pretty clear that he canceled the written code. I'm guessing that would be, we consider that to be like the Ten Commandments and all of the law, with all its regulations against it, instead of opposed to
And
it.
I think the focus is not necessarily, and we'll see in the last section of the chapter, it's not so much that the Jewish people are no longer under the Mosaic law. They certainly are. I'm not trying to say they aren't. But I think Paul's message here to the Gentile Christians, and he is saying to them that those trying to impose you under the law, yes, they can point out that you have not been keeping the law, but you're no longer alienated from God because of your inability or your failure to keep the law of Moses, which you really didn't know anything about anyway. So it's not that it's not just that nobody is under the law anymore. It is that these new Christians do not have to go back and submit. And this is one of the real problems, and we'll look at it in other situations even more clearly, where the attempt to Judaize, basically, they didn't try to make the Gentile Christians adhere to every aspect of the Mosaic law. No, they didn't really say you've got to do all of these things. You have to celebrate all of these festivals. You have to live in a tent during the Feast of the Tabernacles, things like that. But they did have some requirements from the Mosaic law that they wanted to impose on the Gentile Christians. And that's, we'll look at it sometime, the so-called Council of Jerusalem, the requirement, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, don't eat meat that were strangled, and I can't remember the last one, but a few of the laws, they basically said, you don't have to keep the law of Moses, but you need to do this, which the Jews were doing and the Gentile Christians would not have done. They feel like these requirements are moderate enough. You don't have to keep them. You can just do these things, and that's all you have to do. And to a large extent, I think a lot of people today still believe that's what we're under. That this Council of Jerusalem, and I don't want to get too far afield in it, but we'll briefly, that the Council of Jerusalem is binding on Christians today. So you can't eat meat sacrificed to idols. You can't eat animals that were suffocated or whatever. And then something else, I can't remember what it was. But you have to abide by those requirements. Now, I don't think we have to abide by those requirements. I think Paul's teachings are different. That you're not under the law at all. One of the most famous restaurants in the world is in Paris, not surprisingly, an old city like that that's known for its food, the Tour d'Argent, which is well known, and its signature dish, I think I probably told you this before, but its signature dish is smothered duckling cooked in its own blood. Now, that's very different. I can tell already Dolores can't wait to go to Paris and try that out. I'm not telling you. Teddy Roosevelt had it, I can tell you that. And a lot of other famous people have had it. A lot of famous Americans have had it. That would not be kosher. That would not be permissible under the Mosaic Law. You can't eat animals prepared like that. I don't think that's a violation of a sinful thing for us to do. With sexual immorality, there's still, Paul is very clear on stuff like that. Okay, abstain from sexual immorality is the third thing. And that is one thing that we're taught even under Paul. That's not so much a new thing. Certainly, in fact, that would probably have restricted some of the Jewish people's behavior, putting that on them. But so that is something. But the dietary restrictions are not binding whatsoever. And we looked at um, Genesis 9 briefly in the sermon Sunday morning, and God tells Noah and his successors, his descendants, every animal is subject to you, they're afraid of you, and they're all there for your food. Every animal, just like the plants. The dietary restrictions on God's people before the Mosaic Law were none. Now, culturally, they may not have eaten everything, just like now. I mean, there's things that we eat that people from other parts of the country or other parts of the world may not want to eat. And there are certainly things that other people eat that we wouldn't want to eat. The best food I ever had at a wedding reception, and it's not even close. My older brother married a girl from South Louisiana, and all the ladies from the church brought homemade Cajun food to the wedding reception. That's what we had. It was catered by them, I guess you could say. And it was incredible. You don't want to know what's in all of it when it's Cajun food. You don't want to know every detail. There's probably some frog and gator and blood and stuff like that in the sausages and everything. And you might not want to know everything that's in the food you eat right now. Yes, sir.
At this time, the people who had been Jews who become Christians, am I right in thinking that they weren't obligated to keep any of these Jewish traditions or whatever they had done before? Once they had become Christians, they were maybe more or less going to the synagogue and doing those things out of their old tradition. There isn't anything required of them to do that.
That's Paul's contention.
Yeah, I mean, Paul
but Paul does it. That's it. Paul would have. He's not just saying Jews don't have. You non-Jews don't have to become Jewish at all. He is saying the Jewish hope is not found under the law. They don't have to. That's absolutely correct. But they did, and Paul did. And that's the thing. They still. What's that? Yes, he was a Roman citizen who was a Jew. And when he goes back after his missionary journeys, he goes back to Jerusalem. He goes through the ceremonial purification rites, goes to the temple. He tries throughout his ministry. He struggles, I think, a little bit with the food sacrificed to idols. We can talk about that a little bit. But he tries, I think, to not be offensive to anyone. And of course, people who do that end up offending everyone. That's kind of how that works out. But he tries to, when he is in among Jews, to the Jew I became a Jew, to the Gentile I became like a Gentile. So he tries to be all things to everyone, and of course it didn't work for him all that well. It worked for the church, I think, but it makes a lot of enemies for him. But he submitted to all these purification rites. He has Timothy, as a grown man, be circumcised, because Timothy is half Jewish. His mother's Jewish, his father was Gentile. He does not require Titus to be circumcised, because Titus is pure 100% non-Jewish. Never under any requirement to be circumcised. Timothy should have been circumcised when he was 8 days old. His mother, kind of hard to blame his dad when his dad's not of that faith, but I guess you'd say it was his mother's fault. I'm not like beating up on women, but maybe the father wouldn't let him be circumcised. Well, Timothy's opinion when he was 8 days old wasn't really controlling, but the dad was not probably a practitioner. He was not himself circumcised, probably, so he's not going to bind it onto his son. So, but he should have. It should have been circumcised at the time. Now he doesn't need to be, but to avoid and to kind of shut everybody up, we'll have him circumcised. So that's a pretty big sacrifice on Timothy's behalf as a grown man. I mean, it's one thing you have a little boy, a baby, you don't remember it at all. It's another thing when you're a grown man. You're going to remember it, that's for sure. You ladies probably don't care because of all you have to go through being wives and mothers and all that stuff. But it's for a grown man, it's a sacrifice. So the main point is it applies to verses 13 through 15 is that do not submit to Judaizing now, even if it seems like it's not that bad, even if it's only a few things. And sometimes, to me, the Council of Jerusalem, it's not that it was wrong, but it was temporary. The great challenge of the early church is to blend Jewish Christians with Gentile Christians. And a lot of that challenge came from the depravity of the Gentile Christian culture, the various Gentile cultures. It's not just one, but the Greco-Roman, I guess you could call in a big scheme of things, overall, their idolatrous practices. And their idolatrous wasn't just worshiping a different or a false god. It involved things like temple prostitution, male and female, a prevalence of homosexuality, not as two people of that orientation falling in love and having a family together necessarily, but as a way to enforce kind of social hierarchy, kind of like in prison, where the dominant man will sometimes have partners, maybe against their will, whatever. I don't want to get too far into this, but it's a way of establishing the hierarchy and enforcing the hierarchy. The Greco-Roman cultures would do that, especially the Greek cultures. Romans probably inherited it too. And the men would take turns. You might be on the receiving end as a young man, and then as an older man, you had. That's what that's what the gospel is going into. I think sometimes we look at the world and they think it's never been this bad before. It has always been bad. And if God brought the church into a world like that then, you think God doesn't love the church or doesn't want the church working in the world we have today? I mean, kind of the only hope we have is for the church to share Christ. So all of these kind of corrupt, all this depravity that's so prominent in the Gentile culture, it's not so hard to understand why the Judaizing Christians would say, you need to give all that up and you need to take some of our stuff, because while it may exist in our culture, we don't approve of it. It's pointed out by a lot of people these days, Jesus never says anything directly about homosexuality. Jesus' ministry was almost exclusively to Jews, right? And the Jewish culture at the time offered no support for homosexuality at all. You wouldn't have heard any rabbi, any Jewish priest, anything saying homosexuality is okay at that time. What you hear now, I don't know. But the Jewish culture at the time took a very dim view of homosexuality. And Jesus does not tell them, you need to look at it differently. Love is love. Now, I'm probably losing friends, at least on the internet, if whoever sees this. But I'm not trying to antagonize anybody. But looking at Scripture and the view on Gentile culture, trying to apply the teachings of Jesus to it, when Jesus was speaking almost exclusively to Jewish audiences. And the Jewish audiences had a mindset, had a value, had an opinion on this. And Jesus does not correct them. He corrects them on a lot of things. He says, you have heard, but I say. Well, he doesn't say that about this. So if you have some other argument you want to make, that's fine. I think trying to say Jesus says this and Jesus says that on that particular issue, I just don't think there's a lot of support for that. But these people are coming into the church. They're going to be more closely associated with the Jewish Christians who have a lifestyle that is more similar to contemporary American Christianity, for sure. If you're ever in a country and you don't like the food and you don't trust where it's coming from or whatever, try to find a Jewish kosher place to eat. There's not going to be too much in there that you can't handle. Actually, you could probably safely eat at a Muslim halal source of food. They would be more kind of along the lines of what you're used to. It's the non-Abrahamic religion influenced cultures that are pretty challenging to us. So he's saying really to these Gentile Christians, do not let the Jewish Christians make you think you have to be Jewish to be Christian at all. And the implication by that ultimately is, well, if they don't have to be Jewish, neither do the Jews. There was a time in American legal circles, the Supreme Court said, for education purposes, separate but equal. You can discriminate based on race. You can have black schools and white schools, but they can be separate, but they have to be equal. Now, the real ramification of that, they were never equal. But white schools were always better funded, always better teachers, always a better experience than the black schools. And when it got reversed, Brown versus the Board of Education at Topeka, Kansas, when it was reversed, the court said separate is inherently equal. When you have it separate, there's always going to be one that's favored over the other. That's always going to happen. Well, I think Paul would say that's true of the church too. If you say Jewish Christians have one set of standards, Gentile Christians have another, and they're separate, they're equal, but they're separate, eventually one of them is going to be favored over the other. And Paul is trying to say there is one standard. There is one hope. There's one baptism, one of everything, and our salvation is Christ, not our genetic makeup, and not by eating a certain way, and not by a lot of the things that, not whether or not we're circumcised, not whether how well we comply with the Mosaic law. So the sexual morality component of the I don't know why that wouldn't come to me, of the conference of Council of Jerusalem, that's not just, that's throughout Scripture. What that precisely means can be, we'll maybe look at that some other time when we're looking at that, or maybe Galatians, where Paul, I think, is refuting it. But I think I've heard people today in the church say, we can't eat according to these principles today. It's not right. We can't have blood in our food. We can't have black pudding with our breakfast. When we have the full English breakfast, and they include some black pudding. Black pudding is basically sausage made out of primarily blood. We'll get into it a little bit more, but that's the mindset going into the next section. It's not so much a purely how salvation works for everybody today, but in a way it is. It is a message to the Gentile Christians. You do not have to comply with the Mosaic law at all. And yet, I don't think we disregard the Mosaic law. I think it's very important, and we study it, and it's not, haven't been around me enough to know it's not like I ignore the Old Testament. But what do you do with it? Okay, so let's move on now to the, I beat that horse till it was dead and then kept beating it for a while. Let's read verses 16 through 23, if I can read anymore. I think I may have become illiterate. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement and the worship of the angels, taking his stand on visions he has seen, inflated without cause by his fleshly mind, who are holding fast to the head, from whom the entire body, being supplied and held, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the entire body being supplied and held together by the joints and ligaments, grown with a growth which is from God. If you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you are living in the world, do you submit yourselves to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with use, in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men? These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom, in self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. Okay, what do we think about that?
Don't let anyone judge you regarding these things. Me, it's going both directions. I think if you keep them, that's okay, and don't have anybody, don't let anybody tell you it's wrong. And if you don't keep them, don't let anybody tell you that that's wrong. I think that's where that's just what that is.
And it works both ways in the sense that if no one can judge you, then you shouldn't be judging other people on it either. And these are some, I think, areas in which people, not specifically limited to just these things, but basically things that are cultural. And I think when we get so caught up in how people ought to live, maybe in our culture, in our society, the people around us, how we want people to live. And there may be, it doesn't say these things are devoid of wisdom. They have a wisdom. They have a worldly, an earthly wisdom. They're not stupid. When my mother was a young girl, she lived on a small, isolated farm. She picked cotton. She worked, chopped cotton. She worked out in the fields. And when she did, her mother made her wear full-length dress, long sleeves, in Arkansas in the summer. None of them have skin cancer. None of her daughters ever got skin cancer. I saw something to the effect the other day that, you see, we all, when we get hot, we try to wear less clothing so we won't be hot. But, for centuries, people have worn long clothes and, a skirt certainly is going to let the air circulate and be maybe a little bit cooler. You got to keep that sun off. In fact, if you go and see, a lot of times people who work in the fields today in America, most of them are Latino, right? Almost all the produce you buy in a grocery store went through some Latino hands to get there. And when they're out there working, doing that same kind of work that my mom did when she was a girl, I didn't do it, but she did it. They wear long sleeve shirts. They wear long clothes. They cover up. They don't want the sun on them. So there's wisdom, and there's wisdom to it's hot. I'm not going to wear that much because I'm hot. There's all this wisdom. Pick your clothes yourself. Well, if we're not supposed, when Jesus says, do not worry about what you eat and what you drink and what you wear, he doesn't tell you that so you can worry about what other people eat, drink, and wear. Don't you worry about it. Worry about everybody else's. That's not generally how Jesus instructs us. All of these things, and it's one of those things. It sounds easy, kind of in our context sometimes. It sounds logical, and then maybe you're a missionary and you go to a part of the world where the women wear almost nothing, and the men wear almost nothing. You got people walking around naked all the time. Do they have to dress like Europeans, like Americans, in order to be Christians? Yeah. Well, Jesus says you have to be like a little child to enter the kingdom. And in a lot of those cultures, a lot of people today, if the kid's running around the house naked, who cares? Other than he's maybe going to make a real mess or something like that to get cleaned up. But it's not sexual, right? And for a lot of those people, women are always they're having babies and they're nursing and I've told y'all a couple of these stories. Some missionaries were in Africa. They couldn't take all the women running around with no top on, so they got them all T-shirts. Women were glad to get the gift, and they cut out 2 holes in the T-shirt so they could keep nursing kind of on demand. Yeah. And there was another story I read of a missionary who went to Africa, and he didn't try to do that. He had naked people running around all the time, and he was, whatever. And he didn't even really think about it. And then he was flying back home for a while, probably to ask for more money. But he got to the airport, and in developed areas of even primitive continents, I guess you could say, if you evangelize in the remote part of Africa, you might see that. But then when you go back to a city and you get ready to fly home, you're in a Western environment now, pretty much. And he said, I didn't think anything about it when I was out in the bush. When I got back to the airport and I saw all of the magazines at the newsstand with all these women. No, they weren't naked, but they were presented in a way to be attractive sexually. They're fully made up, the clothing and everything. It's all designed to get your attention. Sex sells. And he had been out and he hadn't seen any of that for months, and he was just shocked by the effect on how that worked. So, it is it's, and I'm not advocating it now, but it's one of those things right now. We're used to people dressing a certain way, and if you dress differently, you're going to stand out. And if you don't dress at all, you're really going to stand out, and you'll probably go to jail. That's in our culture. That's what we're used to. That's the way it works. But imposing that on other people who have different backgrounds, different cultures, different standards, things like dressing modestly. Modestly is inherently a cultural concept. Things like men having short hair, women having long hair, when Paul commands that. Well, what's short? What's long? When the Beatles first hit it big in the early 60s, everybody said, look at those hippies. Look how long their hair is, the mop tops and all that. Well, come back 5 years later and see what the Beatles look like. Now, it was really long hair, wasn't it? 63, it was bushy, short but bushy. 68, it's long. It's these topics, it's all relative. So modest is relative. It's defined somewhat by culture. And these holidays, you can look at the Christian holidays, if you will, the one most Christians observe, and you can go back and find pagan origins to pretty much all of them. But most Christians today are not celebrating the pagan origins of the holiday. They're celebrating whatever the contemporary meaning of the holiday is. These are all very basic, elemental things, and it's understandable, I think, to have a hard time with people who live very differently than you. But if you can't live with people from a different culture that you almost never see, you're going to have a real hard time with the emerging cultures, with younger people coming up, and they have different ways of looking at it. They have different things, different points of view, what they will eat. How many of you raised a kid that would eat nothing but chicken nuggets and pizza? Are those the only two kosher foods anymore? Cheese pizza and chicken McNuggets, and those are the only two things you can eat. Maybe an occasional French fry. So they come up and they have different ideas of what long hair is, of what modest is, of what feminine and masculine are. And Jesus was crucified naked. They took everything from him. The intent was to humiliate him. And yet you are mindful. Paul, in other places, is very mindful with the impact our choices have on other people. People do judge you. You know they're going to judge you. But I think sometimes, I am not an absolute 100% teetotaler. Pretty close, but not absolute. I don't drink very often, and I wouldn't drink in the public in Walla Walla College in this area because it doesn't just reflect on me. I think it reflects on the congregation, and I don't want to be a problem. But I think even Paul's teaching on that is not so much that someone will see you and judge you. You're not supposed to let people judge you. But if I went over to somebody's house and they had a problem drinking, they had been alcoholic, maybe they are in recovery, but you go over there to visit them and they're drinking. And if you join in, what is that saying? You're kind of playing into their weakness. Drinking in and of itself, moderate, controlled consumption of alcohol is something. Jesus makes wine for a party. They're all drinking pretty good. But alcoholism, being under the control of something other than God, do not be drunk, but be filled with the Spirit. It's not just take the alcohol out, let the Spirit in. So how all this plays out, it's not so you're not to be judged, but you are to live sacrificially. Be willing to, if it causes my brother to stumble, I'm not going to eat meat at all. If eating meat sacrificed to idols makes him think I worship those idols, I'm not going to eat it, even though the idol's nothing. So we do have rights, but we are called to live sacrificially as well. But really, you don't have the right to judge someone because they didn't sacrifice the way you thought they should sacrifice. But they will. That's how it's going to work. That's how humans work. Okay, we cut that a little short on that particular passage, but I think we took care of it in the earlier passage. We will begin chapter 3 in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, when I get back, whenever that is. And we will finish up ultimately in Colossians. Chapter 4 is pretty brief after we get through chapter 3. Then we will, I think, do Philemon, and that will be what are traditionally considered the prison letters. And if you want something else, let me know after that. So I'm giving you probably at least 2 months' notice, maybe a little bit more if there's something you want to study. And if not, I have a few ideas, but we'll just wait and see. So thank you for your attention and your comments.